In the flickering lantern light of 17th century Edo, a boy stands on a wooden veranda, his face painted a ghostly white, his kimono heavy with silk that seems to weigh down his thin shoulders. To the passing samurai, he is a kagema, a shadow boy, a symbol of elegance and refined pleasure in Japan's floating world. But if you look closer at the archives, past the romanticized woodblock prints and the poetry praising his beauty, the elegance dissolves into something else entirely. Something deliberate, something profitable, something the history books spent centuries trying to forget. Between 1603 and 1868, Japan built what it called the floating world, a network of pleasure quarters where reality was supposed to suspend, where merchants and samurai could abandon the rigid hierarchies of everyday life and drift on currents of entertainment and desire. But this wasn't freedom. This was a highly regulated, inescapable machine of human commodification. And while historians have spent generations studying the legendary oiran, the high-ranking courtesans whose images grace museum walls, they conveniently skip over the boys, the children sold by desperate families as young as 7 years old, the boys who entered a debt-slave system designed with mathematical precision to ensure they could never leave, boys who weren't just entertainers, they were property, managed by strict guilds, protected by the very samurai who claimed to live by codes of honor. These children existed in a world where the word no had been systematically removed from their vocabulary, where the average lifespan was cut short by disease, exhaustion, or the creative punishments establishments used to keep them compliant. This isn't the romanticized version of Edo you see in woodblock prints hanging in art museums. This is the documented reality of the kagema jaya, the boy brothels that operated in plain sight for 265 years. This is a story of stolen childhoods, of systemic exploitation, so normalized that it appeared in popular art, religious texts, and government records without shame. This is the story of a government that found these children so profitable it meticulously recorded their sales while erasing their humanity from every document that mattered. This is the history Japan tried to hide, and these are the voices that are finally, centuries too late, beginning to be heard. The Edo period didn't arrive quietly. It came after more than a century of civil war, the Sengoku period, when regional warlords tore Japan apart fighting for supremacy. When Tokugawa Ieyasu finally unified the country in 1603, establishing the Tokugawa shogunate, the relief was almost physical. After generations of soldiers dying in rice fields and villages burning in the night, Japan could finally exhale. The samurai, whose entire identity had been built around warfare, suddenly had nothing to fight. The swords they carried became ceremonial. The castles they defended became administrative centers, and all that warrior energy, all that trained violence, needed somewhere to go. Peace brought prosperity, and prosperity brought urbanization. Edo, modern-day Tokyo, exploded from a small castle town into the largest city on earth. By the mid-1700s, over 1 million people crowded into its streets, more than Paris or London could claim. Osaka and Kyoto grew alongside it. And with that growth came a demographic problem that would shape everything that followed. Too many men, not enough women. Samurai stationed in castle towns without their families. Merchants traveling for trade. Workers flooding in from rural areas, looking for employment. The gender imbalance wasn't subtle, it was structural. The Tokugawa shogunate's response wasn't to fix the imbalance, it was to manage it. In 1617, the government established Yoshiwara in Edo as Japan's first licensed pleasure quarter, a walled district where prostitution was legal, regulated, and most importantly, taxed. Similar districts followed in Osaka, Kyoto, and Nagasaki. The logic was elegant in its cynicism. You can't eliminate prostitution, so contain it, make it visible enough to control, profitable enough to justify, and distant enough from respectable society that everyone can pretend it doesn't really count as part of their world. This was the birth of the floating world, ukiyo, a concept that would define Edo culture for the next 2.5 centuries. The term itself came from Buddhist philosophy about life's impermanence, but it had been twisted into something else, a justification, an aesthetic. The floating world was supposed to be a place where you abandoned yourself, where you bobbed along on the current of pleasure without worrying about consequences, or tomorrow, or the human cost of your entertainment. It was beautiful. It was celebrated in art and literature, And it was built on bodies that had been bought and sold before they were old enough to understand what was being taken from them. But before we can understand how children fit into this machine, we need to understand something about how Edo period Japan thought about age and gender. Because the category that made the kagema possible, the concept that allowed society to see boys as legitimate objects of desire, didn't come from nowhere. It came from a carefully constructed social role that every Japanese male was expected to pass through on his way to adulthood. They called it wakachu, literally, young person, though the term was never used for girls. A wakachu was a boy between childhood and manhood, roughly ages 7 to 20, before the genpuku coming-of-age ceremony. You could identify a wakachu at a glance by his hairstyle, a small shaved patch at the crown of his head, long forelocks cascading down the sides. It was distinctive, deliberate, a visible marker that said, this person occupies a special category. And that category was significant because wakashu weren't considered children in the way modern societies understand childhood. They were sexually mature, puberty was the dividing line, but free from adult responsibilities. They existed in an in-between space that Japanese society had carved out with remarkable specificity, a space where they could be desired by both men and women without it being seen as transgressive, a space where relationships between older men and younger boys weren't just accepted but celebrated as part of elite culture. This practice had deep roots. In samurai culture, it was called shudo, or wakashudo, the way of youth. An older samurai would take a younger boy as his partner, teaching him martial arts, literature, strategy, the codes of Bushido. The relationship was supposed to be more than sexual, though sex was explicitly part of it. It was mentorship. The older partner provided protection, education, material support. The younger partner offered loyalty, service, and yes, physical intimacy. When the boy came of age, the relationship would end, and he'd become a man capable of taking his own wakashu partner someday. Buddhist monasteries had similar traditions. The Chigo system, young acolytes serving older monks, learning scripture and ritual, and providing sexual services that were considered part of their religious training. Chinese Buddhism had imported the practice around the 9th century, and it had become so normalized that religious texts discussed it without condemnation. Paintings showed monks and their chigo on ceremonial pillows. No one pretended it wasn't happening. No one seemed bothered that it was. So when Edo's pleasure quarters needed to meet the sexual demands of a male-heavy population, and when society already had a built-in category for boys as legitimate erotic objects, the leap to commercializing wakashu wasn't large. It was almost inevitable. The aesthetic was already there. The cultural acceptance was already there. All that was missing was the mechanism to turn boys into purchasable commodities, and Japanese society, with its genius for creating elaborate systems, would build that mechanism with terrifying efficiency. The catalyst was theatre. In 1603, the same year the Edo period began, a shrine maiden named Izumo no Okuni created something new, kabuki. She took traditional dance, mixed it with drama and music and sexually suggestive performances, and staged it in the dry riverbed of Kyoto's Kamo River. It was immediate, electrifying, transgressive, women playing men, sex workers advertising their services through performance art, stories that mocked authority and celebrated the underworld. The crowds went wild. Within decades, kabuki had spread to every major city, but it caused problems. Fights broke out over favored actresses. Samurai abandoned their duties to chase performers. The blend of theatre and prostitution created chaos the shogunate couldn't ignore. So in 1629, they banned women from performing kabuki entirely. The stated reason, it was too erotic, too disruptive to social order. The solution was obvious. If women couldn't perform, boys would. Wakashu kabuki was born. Young boys playing all the roles, male and female, their ambiguous gender presentation perfectly suited to the task. And of course these boy actors also sold sex. The same services, the same clientele, just a different performer. The government had solved exactly nothing. By 1652, the shogunate realized their mistake and banned wakashu from kabuki stages too. But by then, it was too late. The market had been established, the demand had been proven, and the theaters had discovered something. You didn't need boys on stage to sell boys off stage. You just needed the theater as cover. The kagema system emerged from this contradiction. Kagema literally meant shadow space, or in the shadows, The boys who remained in the background of kabuki scenes or backstage, supposedly apprentices learning the craft, but actually available for hire. The theater tea houses that surrounded performance districts became fronts. They were called kagema jaya, shadow boy tea houses, and they functioned as brothels in everything but name. A patron would visit a tea house, supposedly for refreshment during a play's intermission, and leave with a boy for the evening. The fiction that these were theater apprentices, not prostitutes, was maintained just enough to give everyone plausible deniability, and because these boys operated outside the licensed pleasure quarters like Yoshiwara, they were technically illegal. The same government that had created and regulated official prostitution now had an entire shadow industry of boy prostitution that it couldn't quite control. Authorities would occasionally crack down, moving kagema to different districts, issuing new edicts, but enforcement was half-hearted at best. Because the kagema weren't just serving merchants and commoners, they were serving samurai, they were serving Buddhist monks, they were serving the same officials who were supposed to be regulating them. The system protected itself through the participation of everyone with power. What made it all work, what made it sustainable for 265 years, was that Japanese society had built a framework that made buying children feel culturally appropriate. The wakashu concept provided the aesthetic. The samurai shudo tradition provided the precedent. The Buddhist chigo system provided religious cover. All the pieces were in place. All that remained was to add the economic mechanism that would ensure a steady supply of boys. A mechanism that would acquire children from families too poor to resist, bind them with contracts they couldn't break, and extract profit from their bodies until those bodies broke down. That mechanism was coming. And once it arrived, thousands of boys would disappear into those shadows, their names forgotten, their voices lost, their existence reduced to transactions in ledgers that historians would spend centuries trying not to see. The system that fed children into the kagema brothels had a name, Nenki Boko. On the surface it sounded almost respectable, term-limited service or indentured labor. It was a contract system that dated back centuries, originally designed for agricultural workers and domestic servants. A family in need would contract out a family member for a fixed number of years. The employer would pay a lump sum up front. The worker would serve their term, and then they'd be free. In theory, it was a loan with labor as collateral. In practice, especially when applied to the sex trade, it was a legal framework for purchasing human beings. In 1625, amid widespread famine and rural poverty that was flooding cities with desperate families, the Tokugawa shogunate tried to impose limits. They capped Nenki Boko contracts at 10 years maximum, attempting to prevent the worst abuses. It was a half-hearted gesture toward restraint, and in 1698, even that restraint was abandoned. The shogunate lifted the restriction entirely, permitting what they called Ainaki Boko, extended-term servitude. The contracts could now last as long as the brothel or theater wanted. For many children, that meant until their bodies gave out or they aged past marketability. For some, it meant forever. The scholar Kiyoshi Shimodzue would later describe Nenki Boko as linguistic camouflage. By calling it entering service instead of body selling, Japanese society masked the exploitation with respectable terminology. It was the same transaction as slavery, a person's bodily autonomy transferred to someone else in exchange for money, but the paperwork made it look like employment, and that paperwork mattered because it gave everyone involved the ability to pretend they weren't doing what they were obviously doing. When applied to the sex trade, these contracts transferred everything. Not just labor, but bodily autonomy, not just time, but reproductive control, movement, the right to refuse, the right to marry. The contract gave brothel owners the authority to resell the child to another establishment, to arrange marriages without consent, to manage post-mortem affairs if the child died during service, which many did. Legal scholar Kaoru Nakada would later describe these as body-selling indenture contracts, pointing out that despite legal bans on profit-driven human trafficking, these contracts retained every characteristic of human trafficking except the name. But the contracts came in variations, each more predatory than the last. There was shikimono boko, unpaid labor as collateral for a loan, where if the family defaulted, the child's servitude could become lifelong. There was shikiboko, labor-based debt repayment, where the child's earnings supposedly paid down the family's debt, except the earnings never quite covered it. There was iso shikiboko, partial debt repayment through labor, a hybrid that trapped families in perpetual obligations. And for those who thought shorter terms might be more humane, there was dei boko, 1 to 1.5 year contracts, and ikiboko, 1 year servitude. But these short-term contracts often concealed renewal clauses, automatic extensions if the child hadn't earned enough to cover their keep. Evidence from Nishijo village in Mino province, meticulously recorded between 1773 and 1825, reveals the scale. In that single rural village, 50.3% of boys aged 11 or older engaged in some form of servitude. For girls, it was 62%. This wasn't exceptional. This wasn't a crisis year aberration. This was normal. Across rural Japan, selling children into service was as routine as planting rice, and for the urban brothels and theatres, it meant an inexhaustible supply. The procurement process had its own infrastructure. Agents called Zagan travelled the countryside with the practiced eye of livestock buyers, identifying vulnerable families. They targeted the northeastern provinces especially, Tohoku and other regions where crop failures were frequent, where winters were brutal, where families lived perpetually on the edge of starvation. The pitch they made to parents was seductive in its apparent reasonableness. Your son will learn arts, music, dance, poetry, calligraphy. He'll receive an education you can't provide. He'll live in the city, eat regular meals, wear fine clothes. He might catch the eye of a wealthy patron, marry into money, elevate your entire family's status. You're not selling him, you're giving him opportunities. And then came the money. A lump sum payment that could equal a year's rice harvest or more. For a family watching their children's ribs show through their skin. For parents who'd already lost siblings to winter or disease, that money wasn't temptation, it was survival. The choice wasn't whether to sell your child. The choice was which child, and when, and for how much. The contracts were signed, often by parents who couldn't read. The terms were explained, if they were explained at all, in language deliberately designed to obscure, 10-year term, room and board provided. Training in marketable skills, a percentage of earnings to pay down the debt. Everything sounded structured, fair, temporary. What the contracts didn't mention explicitly, because everyone already understood, was what marketable skills meant for a boy being sent to a kagema jaya. What room and board would actually look like, what paying down debt would require, and how the arithmetic would be carefully calculated to ensure it never quite balanced. Children as young as 7 were taken from their villages. By the time they reached 11 or 12, most were in active prostitution. And the psychological framework that made this possible, that allowed parents to hand over their children and society to accept it, was the cultural narrative of sacrifice. The child was sacrificing for the family's good. This was filial piety taken to its darkest extreme. The boy wasn't being betrayed, he was being noble. The parents weren't selling him, they were making a hard but necessary choice. Everyone involved could tell themselves a story that made the transaction feel like something other than what it was. This framing insulated the practice from criticism. When society views child prostitution as a child's noble sacrifice rather than an adult's exploitation, there's no moral outrage to mobilize. There's only sympathy for the family's poverty, for the child's duty, for the tragic necessity of it all. And that sympathy, paradoxically, made the system more entrenched. Because if everyone agrees it's sad but necessary, then no one has to actually stop it. Once acquired, the boys entered a training period that transformed them from rural children into marketable commodities. The establishments understood that their clientele, wealthy merchants, samurai, Buddhist monks, weren't just buying access to a body. They were buying an aesthetic, a fantasy, a performance of refinement that justified the premium prices kagema commanded. And so the boys were trained. They learned to play the shamisen, the 3-stringed instrument whose melancholic sound defined Edo's music. They studied singing, poetry composition, the formal language of tea ceremony. For boys destined for theatre affiliation, they learned the exaggerated movements of kabuki, the vocal techniques for projecting in large spaces, the art of applying stage makeup. Many were specifically trained as onagata female impersonators, learning to move with a feminine gait, to speak in higher registers, to embody the idealized version of womanhood that male audiences wanted to see. But the most intensive training was in presentation. The boy's hair was styled in the wakashu fashion, that distinctive partially shaved crown with long forelocks that marked them as occupying the special in-between category that made them desirable. They were taught feminine mannerisms, ways of laughing behind their sleeves, of lowering their eyes demurely, of moving through space as if they were smaller than they actually were. The goal was creating ambiguity, a figure who could be read as male or female depending on what the client wanted to see. The aesthetic was the product. The child inside it was irrelevant. The physical transformation extended to their bodies. The toxic white lead makeup that courtesans wore, the same makeup that would poison many female prostitutes, was applied to the boys' faces, necks, hands. The aesthetic ideal was ghostly paleness, an otherworldly quality that suggested these boys existed outside normal categories. Their kimonos were elaborate, heavy with silk and embroidery, expensive enough to signal their value, but restrictive enough to limit movement. Everything about their appearance was designed to make them look simultaneously as sophisticated and available, cultured and purchasable. And then came the sexual initiation. The age varied, but most boys entered active prostitution between 10 and 13, as soon as their bodies showed signs of puberty. The concept of age of consent didn't exist in Edo Japan, not because society was deliberately cruel, but because the entire framework for thinking about childhood was different. Life expectancy hovered in the late 30s. Childhood was compressed. Sexual maturity at puberty meant you were ready for adult activities, including selling sex. This wasn't considered unusual. It was simply how things worked. What made kagema particularly valuable, what allowed them to command higher prices than female prostitutes of equivalent status, was the cultural cachet. These weren't street prostitutes. These were refined entertainers, boys who could hold conversations about poetry, who could perform music, who embodied the sophisticated wakachu aesthetic that connected back to samurai and monastic traditions. The client wasn't just buying sex, he was buying participation in an elevated cultural practice, one with historical legitimacy and artistic associations. The kagema were luxury goods. The client base was diverse in ways that complicate simple narratives about Edo sexuality. Buddhist monks were major patrons, continuing the Chigo temple traditions in a commercial context. Samurai, displaced from their traditional role as warriors, sought to maintain the wakashudo relationships that had defined elite culture. Wealthy merchants, newly rich from Edo's booming economy, wanted to emulate samurai refinement, and though it's less documented, because women's sexual agency was generally erased from historical records, woodblock prints confirm that women also patronized kagema. The fantasy of the beautiful youth transcended gender in its appeal. The pricing structure reflected this premium positioning, where a low-ranking female prostitute might charge the equivalent of a few hundred yen for her services, a kagema of similar status could command double or more. Elite kagema affiliated with prestigious theaters could charge prices that put them in competition with the highest-ranking oiran courtesans. The novelty, the aesthetic appeal, the cultural sophistication, it all translated into profit. Profit that the boys themselves would never see. Because while the establishments marketed kagema as refined entertainers, the boys lived as prisoners. Their quarters were cramped, multiple boys sharing single rooms, always under surveillance by house managers who tracked their movements, their conversations, their attempts at friendship that might turn into collective resistance. They couldn't leave the premises without explicit permission, and permission was granted only for work accompanying a client, performing at a theater, appearing at a banquet. The rest of the time they were confined. The daily schedule was relentless. Mornings and afternoons were training, music practice, rehearsal, if theater affiliated, lessons in deportment and conversation. Evenings began with the haramis, the showcase rooms where boys sat on display behind wooden lattices while potential clients walked past, evaluating options like shoppers at a market. The boys who were chosen would be taken either to private rooms in the establishment or escorted to the client's home or a separate house of assignation. Those who weren't chosen sat in the haramis until closing, performing availability whether they felt it or not. The nights were when the actual purpose of their existence became explicit. Sexual services provided to whoever paid. The specifics of what clients wanted varied. For male clients, the historical records indicate anal penetration was the primary service, with the client taking the active role and the boy expected to perform passive submission. Oral sex is almost unmentioned in Edo period documents. suggesting it wasn't part of the standard repertoire. For female clients, the services were less documented, but presumably involved the boys performing more active roles. What's clear from surviving accounts is that refusal wasn't an option. The boy's consent had been purchased with the contract his parents signed. Whatever boundaries he might have wanted to maintain, acts he found too painful, clients who frightened him, services that felt too degrading, none of that mattered. The house decided which clients he would serve. The house decided what services he would provide. His only job was compliance, and woven through all of this was disease. Syphilis had arrived in Japan in 1505, likely brought by Chinese sailors who patronized Japanese brothels in port cities. By the Edo period, it was endemic in the sex trade. Tuberculosis spread easily in the cramped quarters where prostitutes lived. Typhoid broke out periodically, and there were no effective treatments. The medical examinations that began in the 1880s for female prostitutes, spurred by foreign demands in treaty ports, didn't extend to male sex workers. They had even less protection, even less access to care, and the same disease exposure. The mortality data tells the story plainly. At Yokanji Temple in Edo, the graveyard contains the remains of 21,056 Muon prostitutes, those without connection, meaning no family claimed their bodies for burial. Most of these women died in their 20s. The brothel owners couldn't afford proper funerals, so the bodies were dumped at temples that agreed to handle the disposal. And if female prostitutes rarely lived to see 30, male sex workers faced similar or worse outcomes. There was less social investment in keeping them alive, less concern when they fell ill, less guilt when they died young. Because ultimately that was what the Nenki Boko system had created, a mechanism for extracting profit from children's bodies until those bodies broke. The contracts, the training, the pricing structures, the client base, the daily routines, it all functioned with machine-like efficiency to transform rural boys into urban commodities. And when those commodities wore out, the machine simply acquired more. The supply chain never faltered. Every famine sent new families to the Zagan. Every crop failure created new calculations about which child could be spared. Every winter reminded rural parents that they couldn't feed everyone. The system sustained itself through desperation. It justified itself through cultural frameworks that made buying children feel traditional, sophisticated, even noble. And it operated in plain sight, protected by every level of society that benefited from its existence. The physical spaces where kagema lived and worked weren't designed for comfort. They were designed for profit maximization, and that meant cramming as many bodies as possible into the smallest viable spaces. In the theater districts and specialized kagema jaya houses, scattered through neighborhoods like Fukagawa, Yanaka, and the areas surrounding major kabuki theaters, the boys' quarters were windowless rooms, where 3, 4, sometimes 5 boys slept on thin futons laid directly on wooden floors. Privacy didn't exist. Personal space didn't exist. The rooms were monitored constantly by house managers, older men whose job was surveillance, ensuring the boys weren't planning escapes, weren't forming alliances, weren't developing the kind of solidarity that might threaten the establishment's control. The surveillance extended beyond the sleeping quarters. Every movement was tracked. When a boy left for a client appointment, a manager noted the time, the destination, the expected return. When he came back, another note. If he was late, there were questions. If he seemed distracted or uncooperative, there were consequences. The houses operated on the principle that total control required total visibility. The boys lived in a panopticon, where the assumption was always that someone was watching even when they weren't. Movement outside the premises required explicit permission, and permission was granted only for work or the rare occasions when it served the house's interests. Once a year, on the cherry blossom viewing season, some establishments allowed their boys to visit Ueno Park in a carefully orchestrated procession, not for the boys' enjoyment, but as a marketing opportunity. The public could see the house's inventory on display, could observe which boys were the most beautiful, the most graceful, and perhaps make a note to request them later. Even apparent freedoms were advertising. For the boys who had families nearby, and most didn't, having been brought from distant rural provinces specifically to prevent easy contact, there was theoretically permission to leave for a parent's funeral. This was one of the few absences the establishments couldn't deny without appearing monstrously cruel. But in practice, many boys never learned their parents had died. Communication was controlled, letters were intercepted, news was delayed or withheld, and even when a boy was allowed to return home for a funeral, he returned under guard, and the visit was brief enough that there was no opportunity to stay, to refuse to come back, to break free. The daily schedule followed a rhythm designed to extract maximum productivity from bodies that were still growing, still developing, still children in every biological sense, even if society refused to categorize them that way. Mornings began early, before dawn in houses affiliated with theaters, because rehearsals started at first light. The boys who weren't theater active spent mornings in music practice, calligraphy, or other training deemed marketable. Breakfast, when it was provided, was minimal. Rice, pickles, sometimes miso soup, enough to sustain but never enough to satisfy. Keeping the boys slightly hungry was another control mechanism. Full stomachs made people less compliant. Afternoons continued the training cycle. For theater-affiliated boys, this meant costume fittings, blocking rehearsals, voice training to maintain the falsetto required for onagata roles. For those working purely as prostitutes, afternoons involved preparation for evening display, bathing, makeup application, hairstyling, dressing in the elaborate kimonos that clients expected. The process of transformation from child to commodity took hours. The white laid makeup had to be applied evenly to face, neck, hands, any skin that might be visible. The heavy foundation covered blemishes, covered exhaustion, covered the physical evidence of what these bodies endured nightly. As evening approached, the haramis opened. These showcase rooms, the term literally meant needle display, suggesting the boys lined up like thread on display were where the commercial transaction began. The boys sat behind wooden lattices, visible but separated, positioned to catch lantern light in flattering ways. Clients walked the length of the haramis, examining options. Sometimes they'd already decided, having seen a particular boy perform, or having received a recommendation. Sometimes they browsed, comparing faces, bodies, the aesthetic qualities that determined value. The boys chosen were taken to private rooms or escorted to external locations, the client's home, or for wealthier patrons, specialized houses of assignation called ajiya. The boys not chosen remained in the haramis, sitting in display position for hours, maintaining the performance of availability until the house closed for the night or until every boy had been selected. Being passed over repeatedly was its own form of punishment. It meant lower value, which meant the house would be less invested in the boy's well-being, more likely to assign him to less desirable clients or more degrading services. The sexual services themselves, the core function all the training and display existed to facilitate, happened in rooms designed for efficiency rather than comfort. Thin walls ensured managers could hear if a boy tried to refuse a client, or if a client became violent enough to damage the merchandise. The services provided followed established patterns. For male clients, which comprised the majority, the expectation was anal intercourse with the client in the penetrative role. Historical documents from the period are remarkably clinical about this. Anal sex was simply what nanshoku, male-male sexuality, meant in practical terms. The boys were expected to perform submission, to make sounds suggesting pleasure whether they felt it or not, to ensure the client left satisfied enough to return. The physical toll was immediate and cumulative. Repeated anal trauma in pre-modern conditions, without lubricants beyond whatever oil the house provided, without any understanding of anatomy or care, caused tears, bleeding, chronic pain that boys were expected to work through. Clients didn't particularly care about the boy's physical state. They'd paid for a fantasy, and the fantasy required the boy to perform eagerness regardless of what his body was experiencing. For female clients, less common but documented in ukiyo-e prints and literature, the services were less explicitly detailed in surviving records, likely because female sexuality was generally erased from official documentation. But the same power dynamic applied. The boy existed to fulfill whatever the client wanted. His own pleasure, his own comfort, his own humanity were irrelevant variables in a transaction that treated him as a purchased object. And then there was the debt system, the mathematical trap that ensured most boys never escaped even after their contract terms theoretically ended. The initial contract established a baseline debt, the lump sum paid to the boy's family. But that was just the beginning. Every expense the house incurred on the boy's behalf was added to his account. Room and board, obviously, but also the kimonos he wore, the makeup he used, the shamisen he practiced on. medical care if he fell ill, though such care was minimal and often withheld as punishment. Food beyond the basic rations. Every lesson from visiting music or dance masters, the costs accumulated daily, recorded in ledgers the boys never saw, calculated according to house arithmetic that bore no relationship to fair market value. The boy earned a percentage of what clients paid, typically somewhere between 30 and 50%, though the exact split varied by establishment and the boy's perceived value. This money theoretically went toward reducing his debt, but the house controlled the accounting. There were no receipts, no independent verification. The boy simply had to trust that the house was calculating fairly, and of course the house never calculated fairly, because a boy who paid off his debt was a boy who could leave, and the business model required that leaving never quite became possible. Then there were the fines. These were brilliance in their cruelty, because they allowed the house to punish any deviation from perfect compliance while simultaneously increasing the boy's debt. Late to a client appointment, fine. Insufficient enthusiasm during sex, fine. Facial expression suggesting unhappiness, fine. Attempting to refuse a particularly degrading service, major fine, plus physical punishment. The fines were arbitrary enough that the boys could never predict what might trigger one, which meant they lived in constant anxiety, constantly self-monitoring, constantly trying to anticipate what might be interpreted as defiance. Some boys never cleared their debt at all. They worked for 10 years, then 15, then 20, and the ledger never balanced. By the time they aged out of marketability, typically the early 20s, when the wakashu aesthetic no longer fit, they might be released from active prostitution but retained as staff. Some became managers, perpetuating the same system that had destroyed them. Some became procurers, Zagan who traveled to rural areas recruiting the next generation. The cycle fed itself through the trauma it created. For the boys who somehow did clear their debts, freedom was often theoretical. They had no education beyond the narrow skills the house had taught them. Music, poetry, performance, sex work. These weren't skills that translated to other employment. They had no family ties, or the ties they had were with families who'd sold them and felt too ashamed to take them back. They had no money saved, no connections outside the pleasure quarters, no identity beyond the role they'd been forced to perform. Many stayed in the districts they knew, taking whatever work they could find, which often meant continuing in sex work, but now without even the minimal protections an establishment provided. The disease burden made everything worse. Syphilis was so common among sex workers that its symptoms, the chunks, the rashes, the eventual neurological deterioration, were accepted as occupational hazards. The disease progressed in stages, and in the early stages, when the symptoms were still manageable, houses expected the infected boys to keep working. Only when the symptoms became visible enough to repulse clients, when the skin lesions were too obvious to hide with makeup, when the neurological damage made the boy unable to perform, would the house consider removing him from active service. Tuberculosis spread through the cramped, poorly ventilated quarters where multiple boys shared air and futons. The chronic cough, the blood in the sputum, the wasting away. These were so common that they barely merited comment. A boy coughing blood would continue working until he physically couldn't, and then he'd be isolated not for medical treatment but to prevent his death from happening in view of clients. The death itself was inevitable and unremarkable. Typhoid broke out periodically, spread through contaminated water and the poor sanitation of crowded quarters. During outbreaks, boys died within days, their bodies disposed of quickly to prevent panic. The establishments couldn't afford to acknowledge that their conditions were actively killing their inventory, so deaths were attributed to individual weakness, bad luck, the will of the gods, anything except the systemic conditions that made disease inevitable. The life expectancy data makes the cumulative impact clear. The 21,056 female prostitutes buried at Yokanji Temple, most dead in their 20s, represented only one pleasure quarter in one city. Multiply that across Yoshiwara, Shimabara, Shinmachi, the unlicensed districts, the Kagema scattered through theater neighborhoods, and across decades, and the death toll becomes staggering. For male sex workers, who had even less social value and less investment in their survival, the mortality was likely higher. No one was counting. No one particularly cared to count. And this is where the comparison to the idealized samurai wakashudo tradition becomes most grotesque. In that traditional context, the older partner was supposed to protect the younger, to ensure his health, his education, his eventual successful transition to adulthood. The relationship was exploitative in its power imbalance, but there were supposed to be obligations that ran both ways. The Nenya provided for his wakashu. He didn't work him to death. But in the commercial kagema system, all the protective elements had been stripped away, leaving only the exploitation. The aesthetic remained, the partially shaved head, the feminine mannerisms, the cultural references to Shudo, but it was purely cosmetic. The clients could tell themselves they were participating in a traditional practice with historical legitimacy, but what they were actually doing was purchasing access to children who had no ability to refuse, no protection from harm, no expectation of surviving into healthy adulthood. The boys knew this. How could they not? They saw the older boys decline, saw the diseases progress, saw which boys disappeared quietly in the night and were never mentioned again. They understood that their survival depended on remaining valuable enough that the house would invest in keeping them alive, which meant performing enthusiasm they didn't feel, maintaining beauty despite the physical toll, hiding pain and exhaustion behind the white makeup and the practiced smile. And they understood something else, something that made resistance nearly impossible. Everyone who had power over them, the house managers, the clients, the government officials who collected taxes from the districts, the samurai who claimed codes of honor, the monks who claimed spiritual authority, all of them were invested in the system continuing exactly as it was. There was no one to appeal to, no authority that would intervene on a kagema's behalf against a paying client or a profitable establishment. The boys' suffering wasn't a bug in the system, it was how the system was designed to function, so they endured. They woke up each morning in the cramped rooms that smelled of too many bodies in too little space. They applied the makeup that was slowly poisoning them. They performed the training routines that made them more valuable commodities. They sat in the haramis waiting to be chosen. They provided the services that clients paid for. They accumulated debts they couldn't repay through arithmetic they couldn't verify, and they watched their bodies break down, year by year, knowing that everyone around them considered this normal, acceptable, the price of living in the floating world. What makes the kagema system particularly haunting isn't just that it existed. Exploitation of vulnerable populations has appeared in every civilization throughout history. What makes this different, what makes it a case study in how societies normalize the unthinkable, is that Edo Japan didn't hide what it was doing. It celebrated it. It turned the exploitation of children into art, into popular entertainment, into a cornerstone of the culture it would later claim as its golden age. The woodblock prints tell the story most vividly. These weren't obscure images hidden in private collections. They were mass-produced popular art, the posters and magazines of their era, consumed by the growing middle class with the same casual enthusiasm that modern audiences scroll through social media. Artists like Miyagawa Isho, Suzuki Harunobu, Kitagawa Utamaro, Tori Kiyonaga, names that now grace museum walls, created prints depicting kagema in explicit detail. Boys with their distinctive partially shaved heads and long forelocks, positioned in erotic scenarios with older male partners, sometimes with female clients, sometimes in groups that suggested the communal nature of brothel life. The prints were beautiful. That was the entire point. The artist rendered the boys in elegant lines, their kimonos cascading in decorative patterns, their faces serene and inviting, the settings suggesting refined pleasure rather than commercial transaction. A viewer could look at these images and see aesthetics, cultural sophistication, the floating world's promise of escape from everyday tedium. What the prints didn't show, what they were specifically designed not to show, was the cramped quarters where the boys actually lived, the diseases progressively destroying their bodies, the debt ledgers ensuring they never left, the violence required to maintain compliance, the despair that no amount of elegant composition could fully conceal if you looked at the boy's eyes too closely. These prints weren't rare collector's items, they were ubiquitous. A merchant could purchase them from street vendors, a samurai could commission private versions showing his favorite kagema, a household might display them alongside other ukiyo-e depicting landscapes or kabuki actors. Because images of child prostitutes occupied the same cultural category as nature scenes and theatre posters. They were all part of the floating world's aesthetic package, different flavors of the same escapist fantasy. And this normalization through art was devastatingly effective because it trained entire populations to see exploitation as elegance. When you grow up surrounded by images that present child prostitution as sophisticated entertainment, when the most celebrated artists of your era dedicate their talents to making it beautiful, when the visual culture of your society treats it as unremarkable as cherry blossoms or Mount Fuji, you don't develop the critical distance to question whether any of this should be happening. You just accept that this is what the world looks like. The literary culture reinforced what the visual culture established. In 1687, Ihara Saikaku published Nanshoku Okagami, The Great Mirror of Male Love, a collection of 40 short stories celebrating wakashudo relationships and kagema encounters. Saikaku was the era's most popular fiction writer, the equivalent of a best-selling novelist, and he dedicated an entire book to this subject. The stories ranged from samurai boy relationships presented as noble and romantic, to commercial kagema transactions described with humor and erotic detail. Some stories featured boys as young as 9 or 10, framed not as victims but as ideal lovers whose youth and beauty deserved celebration. The book was a commercial success. It went through multiple printings, it spawned imitators, and the cultural message was clear: these relationships and transactions were not only acceptable but worthy of literary treatment, of artistic consideration, of being preserved as part of Japan's cultural heritage. Saikaku wasn't writing underground pornography that society condemned. He was writing mainstream fiction that society celebrated. The normalization was complete. Kabuki theater, even after the formal bans on wakashu performers, continued incorporating kagema characters and nanshoku themes into its plays. The all-male theater, where adult actors now played all roles, including women, still featured characters who were obviously kagema, young male prostitutes whose stories provided dramatic tension and romantic subplots. Audiences watched these plays in packed theaters, sometimes thousands at a time, and absorbed narratives where young male sex workers were heroes, tragic lovers, figures worthy of empathy, but empathy that never translated into questioning why these figures existed in reality, not just on stage. The theater audiences could weep at the fictional kagema's suffering, while ignoring the actual kagema working in the tea houses surrounding those same theaters. The compartmentalization was staggering. Entertainment provided a space to feel emotions about exploitation, without those emotions ever threatening the system that made the exploitation possible. You could be moved by the play, step outside during intermission, hire a real kagema for the evening, and see no contradiction in these actions. The fiction inoculated you against the reality, but perhaps the most disturbing normalization came from religious institutions. Buddhist monks constituted a major portion of the kagema client base, and this wasn't hidden or shameful. It was documented in temple records, depicted in woodblock prints, showing monks with kagema on ceremonial pillows, discussed in literature without apparent condemnation. The Chigo tradition, temple acolytes serving older monks sexually, had been part of Japanese Buddhism for centuries, imported from Chinese monastic practices around the 9th century. When that tradition moved into the commercial sphere, when monks began patronizing kagema brothels instead of keeping personal acolytes, it was seen as a practical adaptation, not a moral crisis. Ukiyo-e prints from the period show Buddhist priests embracing kagema, and these images circulated without scandal. One famous print depicts a chief priest with a young kagema on a ceremonial pillow. The religious paraphernalia, visible in the background, as if to emphasize that there was no conflict between spiritual authority and sexual access to children. The absence of doctrinal prohibitions against male-male sexuality within Buddhist clergy meant that monks faced no institutional consequences for their participation. Shinto priests similarly operated without stigma when engaging with kagema. The philosophical frameworks actually provided cover. Buddhism taught impermanence, the transitory nature of all things, desire as a natural force to be understood rather than simply suppressed. Some interpretations suggested that male-male sexual acts were less karmically problematic than male-female ones because they didn't risk creating unwanted children, didn't threaten family structures, didn't carry the same weight of consequence. These theological rationalizations allowed religious figures to participate in child exploitation while maintaining their spiritual authority. The cognitive dissonance was resolved by reframing the exploitation as a lesser form of desire, almost a spiritual practice in its own right. This religious participation did something crucial. It sanctified the system. When the people who are supposed to represent moral authority, the monks who teach Buddhist precepts, the priests who maintain Shinto shrines, are themselves clients, it sends a message that this isn't exploitation at all. It's just another aspect of the floating world, another form of pleasure that exists in a special category outside normal moral judgment. If holy men can participate without shame, how can it be wrong? The government's role in this cultural normalization was equally significant. The Tokugawa shogunate didn't just tolerate the kagema system, it implicitly endorsed it through tax collection and regulation. The same authorities who issued periodic edicts attempting to contain kagema to specific districts were collecting revenue from those districts. The same officials who claimed to uphold Confucian values about social order and proper behavior were ensuring the smooth operation of a child prostitution industry because it was profitable, politically convenient. The regulations themselves revealed the government's actual priorities. The edicts didn't try to end the practice, they tried to organize it, to make it more manageable, to ensure it didn't disrupt other aspects of social control. Move the kagema to this district instead of that one. Require them to register here instead of there. Make sure they're not posing as theatre apprentices too obviously. These weren't moral interventions. These were administrative adjustments to maintain a profitable system while giving the appearance of government oversight. And this governmental participation normalized the system at the highest level. If the shogunate itself was managing kagema districts, collecting taxes from kagema brothels, issuing regulations about kagema operations, then how could any individual citizen conclude that this was morally unacceptable? The message from the top down was clear. This is how society functions. This is normal. This is regulated, controlled, part of the proper order of things. The cumulative effect of all these normalizing forces, the art, the literature, the theatre, the religious participation, the government regulation, was a society that couldn't see what it was doing as exploitation. Every institution that should have provided a critical perspective instead provided justification. Every voice that should have objected instead participated. The cultural infrastructure for questioning the system simply didn't exist. And perhaps most insidiously, this normalization affected the boys themselves. When every authority figure confirms that your role is natural and appropriate, when the culture produces beautiful art depicting your exploitation as elegance, when religious figures who should protect you instead purchase access to you, when the government that should defend the vulnerable instead regulates your commodification, you internalize the message. You begin to believe that this is what you're for, that your suffering is normal, that resistance would be irrational, because everyone with power and knowledge agrees that this is how things should be. The psychological damage of this cultural consensus was perhaps more devastating than the physical abuse. Physical wounds heal, at least sometimes, but when an entire society tells a child that his exploitation is not only acceptable, but culturally sophisticated, that his suffering is not suffering at all, but participation in a refined aesthetic tradition, that his role as a purchased object is not degradation but duty, those messages embed themselves in ways that never fully heal. This is what normalization does. It doesn't eliminate the harm, it just makes the harm invisible to everyone except those experiencing it, and even they begin to doubt their own perceptions, to wonder if perhaps everyone else is right and their pain is imaginary or self-inflicted, or the price of living in a society that is, by all accounts, civilized, peaceful, culturally sophisticated. The Edo period is celebrated today for its art, its literature, its theatre, its refinement. Museums display the woodblock prints. Scholars study the literary works. The floating world aesthetic has become synonymous with Japanese cultural achievement, and none of that is wrong exactly. The art was beautiful, the literature was innovative, the culture produced remarkable achievements, but those achievements were built on bodies that were bought before they were old enough to understand what was being taken from them. The elegant prints were funded by brothels selling children. The celebrated literature romanticized exploitation. The sophisticated culture required victims. And for 265 years, an entire society agreed that this was not only acceptable, but worthy of preservation, of celebration, of pride. That's what makes this history so disturbing. Not that exploitation happened. exploitation always happens, but that it happened in plain sight, documented in beautiful images and eloquent prose, sanctified by religious authority, regulated by government oversight, and celebrated as cultural achievement. The horror isn't hidden in dark corners, it's hanging on museum walls, studied in literature classes, cited as evidence of how sophisticated Edo culture was. The floating world wasn't an escape from reality, it was reality, just packaged in aesthetic terms that made people comfortable ignoring what they were participating in. And that comfort, that cultural consensus that made exploitation feel like elegance, is what allowed the system to persist for centuries, destroying thousands of lives while producing art that people still celebrate today without quite acknowledging what that art was really depicting. The Tokugawa shogunate was not oblivious to the kagema problem. They knew exactly what was happening in the theatre districts, in the unlicensed pleasure quarters, in the tea houses that fronted as respectable establishments while selling children in back rooms. They issued edicts, they attempted regulations, they moved kagema operations from one district to another, banned certain practices, threatened penalties, but every intervention shared a fundamental characteristic. None of them were designed to end the system, they were designed to manage it. The first major attempt came in 1652, the same year Wakoshu kabuki was banned from the stage. The shogunate prohibited young boys from performing in theatres, hoping that removing them from public performance would eliminate the prostitution that had become inseparable from kabuki. The logic seemed sound on paper. No boy actors meant no boy prostitutes using theatre as cover. The problem solved itself, except it didn't. The ban simply pushed the practice slightly underground while leaving the fundamental economics untouched. Boys stopped appearing on stage in official roles, but they remained in the theatres as apprentices and assistants, still available through the same tea house intermediaries, still marketed with the same wakachu aesthetic. The clients didn't disappear because the performers were no longer technically on stage. The demand remained constant and the supply adapted. In 1685, the shogunate tried a different approach, cracking down on what they called o-wakashu, older men, sometimes into their mid-20s, who deliberately delayed their coming-of-age ceremonies to remain marketable as wakashu. This was seen as particularly problematic because it suggested that the wakashu role, which was supposed to be a temporary life stage, was being exploited as a permanent commercial category. If grown men were pretending to be adolescent boys to continue sex work, the shogunate reasoned, then the aesthetic had become corrupted beyond its cultural legitimacy. This intervention was partially effective, but only in the narrowest sense. It forced some aging sex workers to formally transition to adult male status, which meant they could no longer present as wakoshu. But it did nothing to address the actual children in the system, the 7 and 10 and 13-year-olds who weren't delaying anything. They were simply being exploited at the age society had decided, made them available. The ban on owakoshu actually made things worse for younger boys by eliminating competition from older workers, increasing demand for genuine children. Throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, the shogunate issued periodic edicts attempting to restrict kagema to specific districts to contain the practice the way they'd contained female prostitution in licensed quarters like Yoshiwara. The goal was administrative control, not moral intervention. If kagema operated only in designated areas, they could be taxed more efficiently, monitored more easily, kept separate from respectable neighborhoods. But enforcement was sporadic at best. The kagema jaya operated wherever clients were willing to pay, which meant they spread through any district with theaters, temples, or wealthy residents. The shogunate would issue an edict, the brothels would relocate temporarily, and within months they'd drift back to their previous locations or find new ones equally convenient. The enforcement paradox was this: the government wanted control, but it also wanted revenue. The taxes collected from pleasure districts, including kagema operations, represented significant income for the shogunate and local authorities. More fundamentally, providing sexual outlets for the male-heavy urban population was seen as essential for social stability. Better that frustrated men visited brothels than that they caused disturbances elsewhere. The kagema system, whatever moral objections individuals might privately hold, served political and economic functions that outweighed any impulse to eliminate it. So the regulations continued in this half-hearted pattern: edicts that sounded strict, enforcement that was minimal, adaptations that preserved the core practice while appearing to comply with official restrictions. The system was too profitable, too politically convenient, too culturally embedded to actually dismantle, and everyone involved understood that the regulations were performance, not genuine reform. The only serious disruption came from outside, from a source the shogunate couldn't ignore because it threatened Japan's international standing. In 1872, 4 years into the Meiji era that would eventually end the Edo period's social structures, a Peruvian ship called the Maria Luz stopped in Yokohama harbor for repairs. A Chinese coolie working on the ship escaped and swam to shore, claiming he was being held in slavery. Japanese authorities investigated, found the conditions appalling, and prepared to prosecute the ship's captain for human trafficking. The captain's lawyer mounted an unexpected defense. He pointed to Japan's own prostitution system, to the licensed quarters where women and children were sold into sexual servitude, to the debt bondage that trapped them for years or lifetimes. How could Japan condemn the Maria Luz for trafficking labor when Japanese law explicitly permitted the buying and selling of human beings for sexual purposes? The parallel was uncomfortable and undeniable. The international embarrassment forced the Meiji government's hand. They issued the Geishugi Kaihu Rei in 1872, the Prostitute Liberation Ordinance, officially emancipating prostitutes and indentured sex workers from their contracts. The proclamation was celebrated as progressive reform, proof that the modernizing Meiji government was eliminating feudal exploitation practices. But it was almost entirely cosmetic. The ordinance declared existing contracts void, but it provided no enforcement mechanism, no penalties for establishments that ignored it, no support system for freed prostitutes who had nowhere to go, and no means of survival. Most women and boys who were supposedly liberated simply voluntarily re-entered new contracts with the same establishments. The paperwork changed, the terminology changed, but the fundamental transaction bodies purchased, debts accumulated, freedom denied, continued under different documentation. What actually ended the kagema system wasn't moral awakening or effective regulation. It was structural transformation. The 1871 abolition of the samurai class eliminated a major client base, the warriors who had patronized kagema as continuation of traditional wakasudo practices. The modernization of kabuki theater in the 1870s eliminated the apprenticeship systems that had supplied many boys to the trade. The industrialization of Japan's economy created alternative forms of child labor that, while still exploitative, offered different calculations for desperate families. Factory work paid poorly and endangered children's health, but at least it didn't involve the specific trauma of sexual service. The formal closure of specialized kagema districts came in the mid-1870s, driven more by Western pressure than domestic reform impulses. Christian missionaries from Europe and America expressed horror at Japan's visible sex industry, particularly the trafficking of children. For a Meiji government, desperate to be seen as civilized by Western standards, to renegotiate the unequal treaties that had been imposed after Perry forced Japan's opening, managing international perception became crucial. The kagema had to become less visible, less obviously a child prostitution system, less embarrassing to explain to foreign observers. So the districts closed officially. The kagema jaya were shuttered or converted to other purposes. The practice moved underground, continuing in more discreet locations with less obvious marketing, but operating at a much smaller scale. By 1900, the kagema system as Edo had known it, boys displayed openly in tea houses, advertised through woodblock prints, celebrated in popular culture, had largely dissolved, but dissolution isn't the same as accountability. No one was prosecuted for the centuries of child exploitation, no establishment owners faced consequences, no government officials lost positions for having regulated and profited from the system. The cultural works that had normalized it, the woodblock prints, the literature, the theatrical traditions, weren't destroyed or recontextualized. They simply became historical artifacts, their original purpose gradually forgotten or reframed as something less troubling than what they actually were. As for resistance from the boys themselves, the historical record shows scattered individual attempts at escape, almost all unsuccessful. Some boys fled their establishments and tried to disappear into other cities, changing their names, their appearances, their identities. A few succeeded, though we don't know how many because successful escapes by definition leave no record. Most were caught, returned, and punished, beating severe enough to deter future attempts, fines that increased their debt beyond any hope of repayment, sometimes confinement that made even the limited freedoms they'd had disappear entirely. There was no organized resistance movement, no collective uprising, no network of escaped kagema working to free others. The system was designed to prevent exactly that kind of solidarity. Boys were isolated from each other emotionally even when physically proximate, monitored constantly, rotated between establishments to prevent long-term relationships from forming. The few friendships that developed were discouraged and disrupted. Any hint that boys might be coordinating was met with immediate separation. Some boys aged out of the system, reaching their early 20s when the wakashu aesthetic no longer fit and client demand dropped. A few were released or graduated to other roles within the pleasure quarters. Some became theatre workers behind the scenes. Some became house managers perpetuating the system they'd suffered under. Some became Zagan procurers who traveled to rural areas recruiting the next generation of boys. The cycle fed itself through the trauma it created, turning some victims into perpetrators as the only path to survival. Very rarely, a wealthy patron might purchase a boy's freedom outright, paying off the accumulated debt and establishing the boy as a servant or adopting him formally. These cases were exceptional enough to be remembered in period literature, precisely because they violated the system's fundamental logic. The system required that boys remain trapped. Individual acts of mercy that freed specific boys didn't threaten the larger mechanism, but they did reveal what was possible if anyone with resources actually cared about these children's welfare. That so few did, despite the thousands of wealthy men who patronized kagema over centuries, speaks to how thoroughly the culture had naturalized the exploitation. The absence of organized resistance reflects something deeper than lack of opportunity. It reflects the completeness of the cultural consensus. When every institution confirms that your exploitation is normal, when every authority figure participates in or profits from the system, when the culture produces art celebrating your commodification, when even religion provides no sanctuary, resistance begins to feel not just dangerous but irrational. The boys couldn't appeal to justice because there was no concept of justice that included them. They couldn't seek protection because the people who should protect them were their purchasers. And so they endured, mostly silently, their resistance limited to small refusals that accomplished nothing but preserved some sense of self. A boy might refuse to smile at a client he particularly hated, accepting the punishment that followed. Another might deliberately perform poorly, sabotaging his own marketability in a gesture of defiance that hurt him more than anyone else. These tiny rebellions changed nothing about the system, but they mattered to the boys who enacted them, proof that they could still choose something, even if the only choice available was how to suffer. The system didn't end because the boys resisted. It didn't end because authorities intervened. It ended because historical forces larger than any individual or institution transformed Japanese society in ways that made the kagema system obsolete. The exploitation didn't stop because anyone decided it was wrong. It stopped because it was no longer economically and socially convenient. That's what makes the regulatory history so bleak. For 265 years, the system operated with full government knowledge and implicit approval. When it finally ended, it wasn't through justice or reform, it was through historical accident, through transformations that had nothing to do with the boys' welfare and everything to do with Japan's relationship with Western powers and its own modernization project. The boys who suffered during those 265 years received no apology, no recognition, no memorial. They simply disappeared from history, their voices unrecorded, their names forgotten, their existence reduced to figures in woodblock prints that people now admire without quite understanding what they're looking at. We don't have their words. That's the most haunting part of this entire history. No kagema wrote, "I suffered." No 7-year-old left a diary entry about the day the agent came to his village. No 12-year-old recorded what it felt like the first time a client chose him from the harimis. No 15-year-old dying of syphilis left a letter explaining what it was like watching his body break down while everyone around him treated it as ordinary. The archives contain transactions, not testimonies. We see these boys through the eyes of purchasers who wrote erotic poetry about them, artists who rendered them in beautiful lines, government officials concerned with tax revenue and district organization, never through their own perspectives. This absence is itself evidence. They were considered so insignificant that no one bothered to preserve their voices. While high-ranking Oirang courtesans occasionally left poetry, achieved enough fame that their names survived, had some limited agency to refuse certain clients or negotiate terms. Kagema had none of that. They existed in the shadows, and when they died young, they disappeared completely. Even the mass graves like Yokanji Temple recorded them as muin, without connection, meaning no one claimed their bodies, no one marked their graves with names, no one remembered them as individuals who mattered. But we can infer what they experienced, even without their direct testimony. From modern trafficking survivors, we know the psychological patterns that debt bondage creates. The feeling that you'll never escape, that the debt grows faster than you can possibly reduce it. The self-blame, the internalization of messages that this is what you deserve, that you brought this on yourself through some fundamental unworthiness. The belief that your family will reject you if you return, that you're too contaminated by what's been done to you to ever be accepted in normal society. Kagema almost certainly experienced these same patterns. The mechanisms of control haven't changed that much across centuries, only the terminology and the technology. From the physical evidence, we know their bodies were breaking down constantly. The disease rates, the mortality data, the graveyard statistics all point to lives of chronic pain, progressive illness, bodies pushed far beyond what they could endure. We know what repeated sexual trauma does to developing bodies. We know what tuberculosis feels like, what syphilis looks like in its advanced stages. We know the boys felt pain, constantly, and worked through it, because the alternative was punishment that made the pain worse. From basic human psychology, we know what forced childhood sexual exploitation does to developing minds. The dissociation, the fragmentation of self, the inability to form healthy attachments, the way trauma embeds itself in the body and nervous system in ways that outlast any specific memory. We know that boys who survived into adulthood carried these wounds invisibly, that they likely struggled with relationships, with trust, with any sense that the world was fundamentally safe, or that they deserved care. The psychological damage would have been permanent and pervasive, and we know that they had no one to tell, no therapist to process trauma with, no support group of fellow survivors, no cultural framework that recognized what had been done to them as harm rather than duty. They carried everything alone, in silence, until their bodies gave out, or they aged beyond marketability and were discarded into whatever marginal existence they could scrape together. This history matters not to shame modern Japan. The culture that created the kagema system is not the culture of contemporary Japan, any more than the America that enslaved millions is the America of today. Societies change, values evolve, what was normalized becomes unthinkable. But the history still matters because it reveals patterns that persist. Child exploitation operating in plain sight, normalized by cultural frameworks, protected by economic incentives, maintained by powerful men claiming honor and respectability. This pattern repeats globally, historically today. The specifics change, the aesthetics shift, but the fundamental mechanisms of how societies normalize harm against the vulnerable remain remarkably consistent. Understanding how Edo Japan convinced itself that buying children was sophisticated cultural practice helps us recognize when our own societies are employing similar rationalizations for different exploitations. The floating world culture is celebrated in museums worldwide. The woodblock prints hang in prestigious galleries. Scholars write books about the aesthetic achievements of Edo period art and literature. The kabuki theatrical tradition is recognized as cultural heritage, and none of that is inherently wrong. The art was genuinely beautiful. The culture produced real achievements, but those achievements were funded and inspired by a system that consumed children's lives to produce entertainment for adults who never had to see the cost of what they were consuming. We can acknowledge both realities simultaneously. The prints are beautiful, and they document exploitation. The literature is innovative, and it normalizes harm. The culture achieved sophistication, and it required victims. These truths don't cancel each other out. They coexist, uncomfortably, forcing us to confront what cultural achievement sometimes costs, and who pays that cost, while others claim credit. The boys on the verandas, faces painted white, kimonos heavy on their thin shoulders. They were someone's sons before they became kagema. Someone held them as infants. Someone taught them to walk, Someone loved them before the debt collector arrived, before poverty made their parents calculate which child could be sacrificed so others might survive. They had names that mattered to someone, dreams that didn't include any of this, futures that were stolen before they were old enough to understand what was being taken. We can't recover their voices, we can't undo what was done to them, we can't bring justice to boys who died centuries ago without ever experiencing anything that resembled justice in their actual lives. But we can refuse to let their existence be erased. We can insist that the history we tell about Edo Japan includes them, not just as aesthetic objects in woodblock prints, but as children who suffered and died to create the floating world everyone else enjoyed. We can look at those beautiful prints and see both the artistry and the exploitation. We can study the literature and recognize that when it celebrates kagema, it's celebrating something that destroyed real lives. We can appreciate the cultural achievements while acknowledging what those achievements required and who paid the price. That boy on the veranda, standing in flickering lantern light, performing availability, he didn't feel he was real. He hurt, he mattered. His name is lost, his voice unrecorded, his life reduced to a transaction in a ledger that no one preserved because no one thought his individual existence was worth documenting. But he was here. He lived through something we can barely imagine, in a world that offered him no escape, no hope, no recognition that anything wrong was happening to him at all. This is his story, and the thousands like him who vanished into the shadows that gave them their name. We can't give them back what was taken, but we can refuse to forget that they existed, that they suffered, that they deserved better than what their society gave them. We can honor their absence by telling the truth about what happened, even when that truth complicates the narratives of cultural achievement we prefer to tell ourselves. The floating world wasn't an escape from reality. It was reality for boys who never got to escape, whose entire lives were consumed by other people's fantasies, whose suffering made possible the elegance everyone else celebrated. They deserve to be remembered as something more than shadows. This is the least we can do, to say their names, even when we don't know what those names were, to acknowledge that they lived, to insist that their existence matters even now, especially now, when understanding how societies normalize harm against children might help us recognize and resist the systems that continue doing the same thing today, just with different aesthetics and different rationalizations. They were here, they mattered. And this is the history Japan tried to hide, the voices that were never allowed to speak, finally being heard centuries too late, but heard nonetheless. Because silence, in the end, only protects those who benefit from forgetting, and these boys deserve better than our continued forgetting.